Okay, welcome everybody to our lecture for today. I'm Naomi Lindstrom, and I'm introducing Professor Laura Limonic. She's an assistant professor of sociology at SUNY Old Westbury, and she's author of a new book, which just came out this year, Kugel and Frijoles, Latino Jews in the U.S., Wayne State University Press. She was born in Argentina. Her family came to the U.S. when she was 6 during the military dictatorship, reasonably enough. And she's done a lot of research on immigration to the U.S. in recent times and religious community building. And her current project is on Chabad. She's done some work in Argentina and going to be doing work on Mexico. She's also very active in the profession. She's been a very loyal member of the Latin American Jewish Studies Association and AJS, and she's also very active in the Association for the Social Scientific Study of Jewry, ASSJ. She has been named to the board and edits the newsletter. And she's also been a policy person at one phase in her life. She was a policy person and issued policy papers. So she has those in her vita as well as her academic studies. And she's also a runner, and she's going to be in the New York City Marathon this Sunday. Went running this morning, right?
Oh, yes.
Yes.
That's the idea. I'll be in it. Will I finish? I don't know.
So before she starts up, a couple of announcements. Her talk is being sponsored by a project within the Schusterman Center, which is called Gale Collaborative on Jewish Life in the Americas, and is organized by myself and by Professor Robert Abzug, who's sitting here. We just wanted to mention some upcoming events. In the spring, among other things, we're going to show the film The Last Suit, El Último Traje, together with the general libraries. There's our library person, Uri Kolodnik.
He's not general anymore.
Oh, okay. UT Libraries. And we run a film series with him. This is a fiction film from Argentina about a very old Holocaust survivor who feels compelled to go back to Poland and make contact with the person he feels saved him. But of course, there are many complications. The plot can't possibly be that simple. It's a very good movie. Also, Raylene Wise is going to give a talk in the spring on singing in Castilish, which is a combination of Castellano, Spanish, and Yiddish. It's on Kugel Katz, who was this Argentine singer who, when he sang in Spanish, there was Yiddish in it. And when he sang in Yiddish, some Spanish would always creep in. He never sang in just one language. And then there's one other event, which Bob Abzug is going to tell you about.
Okay, actually, one future thing. In relation to the Austin Jewish Film Festival, they will be showing a film on actually Chabad in Montana. Apparently the 250 Jews in one part of the state and maybe 1,000 in the entire state probably are now 1,050 as a result of Chabad blanketing the area. And with some controversy about it from Jews, but I'm also going to be giving a paper, and it will be linked to this film, on a particular incident in the 1990s that happened in Billings, Montana, as a way to, an anti-Semitic incident, as a way to sort of understand the relationship of the Jewish population of about 250 to the broader city, which is about 100,000. And it'll be Montana Week, which is kind of odd, but we could do Texas Week at some point, but Montana for the moment. And then in the fall, we'll be having at least one and perhaps two Canadian scholars, one certainly from University of British Columbia, and perhaps another one from University of Toronto, in part talking about the comparison between US and Canadian Jewry, Jewish life, and other more specific topics about Canada, which, by the way, relative to the United States, has about the same percentage of Jews as the United States. It's just the population is a tenth what our population is. So anyway, those are two North American events that are happening, and this is we're always trying to balance this. So there you go.
Okay, and this person who just walked in is the speaker in the spring that I was talking about,
Right.
Raylene Wise. So her talk is the one on Castidish in the work of Kugel. So now back to the present moment after all these future events and Laura Limonic.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you all for being here, and thank you so much for inviting me, Naomi and Bob, the Schusterman Center. It's really an honor to be here, so thank you. Unfortunately, in order for me to click through these, I have to stand here. So I will do my best to sort of figure out the best way to click through this. So, this is a long project that I've been working on for too many years. It really came out of my own experiences. And Naomi said, I was born in Argentina, and I grew up in Boston. And I grew up in, if anyone is familiar with the Northeast, in a place called Newton, Massachusetts. There are a lot of Jews in Newton. But my family was always sort of the outsider. People would come over to our house when they had to do their Spanish projects because we were the Latinos in town. And people would say to me, well, I don't understand. You're so white. How can you speak Spanish? My brother, on the other hand, was named Fernando. And they would tease me and they would go, oh, is your brother adopted? So my poor brother has a complex about it, probably to this day. And there was always this sort of feeling of being and of not being of two worlds. And what does that mean? And how do we construct our identity? How do we construct our identity as immigrants? What does it mean to come to a country and you're faced with a number of different options? One of my favorite quotes is not mine. I'm not from Venezuela, but one of my respondents was going to a synagogue in Atlanta, and they said, "Oh, you're converting. That's so nice." So there was a lot of examples like this, and it wasn't really until I got to graduate school that I thought, wait. This is a topic I can research. There's actually language and there's theory that can help me understand what it means for identity construction, what ethnicity means for different people, how my experience might be part of a larger experience, and how it actually might tell us something about how ethnicity and race is constructed in the United States and what it means for immigrants. So when I was in Boston, I remember thinking, I don't understand. How is it that people don't know that there are Jews in other countries besides the United States? I mean, it seems kind of obvious. In fact, many of our traditions were similar, right? We spoke Yiddish, speaking of Yiddish, not me, my parents. We celebrated the holidays. We ate similar-esque foods. Maybe they were pronounced a little bit differently. We probably had a little bit more treif than was common in the United States. There's a lot of ham and cheese in Argentina. But in general, we did lots of Jewish things, but we also did lots of Argentine things and lots of Latin things. Everybody came over for the World Cup. This was huge. We had big barbecues with things that Jews really don't eat, at least here in the United States. There was tango dancing and salsa dancing. At the end of Seder's, people sang tangos at my house. This was very different than what the Seders looked like at my friends' houses. But, in general, there we go. The story of Latino Jews, Jews that were born in Latin America and immigrated to the United States, so first-generation Jews, is essentially a story of assimilation. They're able to and all immigrants assimilate somehow, whether you assimilate here on the bottom, in the middle, or you assimilate on the top. You insert yourself in the American landscape to some extent. So the story of immigration and how immigrants assimilate is essentially a story of how folks use socioeconomic advances, language acquisition, acculturation. They assimilate to the culture that they come into. But it inevitably involves a change in ethnic identity. And that's the piece that we often don't talk about. And that's a little bit of a cultural piece. And it's come out of, sociologists don't like to talk about culture so much anymore. But ethnic identity is really, ethnicity is tied into culture. So we can't talk about ethnicity without really thinking about what does culture mean. So taking from this idea of ethnic identity, what options do we have, do people have, do immigrants have in choosing their ethnicity? How do immigrants choose or get assigned to an ethnic group? And what constraints do they face in the process? This was a key question in my research. Can you just be a Jew? Even if your name is Pablo, Gold. Does Pablo not make you a real American Jew? If you have an accent, are you on the outskirts of the Jewish mainstream? Can you be a Latino? Everybody in my interviews had some sort of Latino connection, but they phenotypically resemble the white mainstream. So what does that mean? Can you legitimately claim some sort of Latina, Latinx identity? And what does it mean for different people at different times in their immigration process? And then the third question that arose that I really wanted to think about was this idea of pan-ethnicity. First of all, what does it even mean? What does Latino even mean, really? And if you are sort of an American Jew, you're sort of a Latino, but not really either, does a new ethnicity emerge, right? Can you be a Latino Jew? And how does that happen? Just so you have an idea of how I did my research and where I did it, and I apologize in advance, but Texas, I wouldn't say Texas didn't make the cut, but Texas was not one of the places where I did my field work, in part because you can't hit every place. I did a lot of interviews. I mostly did my ethnographic research at a Chabad center called the Jewish Latin Center in New York, but I attended a lot of weddings and temples and JCCs and events in Miami and New York and Boston. I interviewed about 85 people. I interviewed 85 people. The median age was 40. They were all professional. And this really tells us something about the migration stream and who comes. 60% were married. Many had children. All of them had legal residence. This doesn't mean they all came here legally, but at the time of the interview, they all had legal residence. And they all were on the higher end of the socioeconomic status. Again, I did my research over a number of years. Many people came after the 2001 Argentine crisis. I would say they probably climbed the socioeconomic ladder throughout their time here and by the time I interviewed them. Yeah.
Did you have no one from Cuba?
So I didn't interview Cubans because I chose to interview more recent immigrants and immigrants that didn't have an established community, in large part because I was interested in understanding if people from different communities would form a new pan-ethnic community. And Cubans aren't replenished. Cuban Jews aren't replenished. They came over, and for the most part, we don't have new Cuban Jews coming over to replenish any sort of ethnicity or ethnic ties. We could talk about Cuba later if you want. Okay, so I want to just talk a little bit about, what Jewish life in Latin America is like. And really pick out the sociological trends, the sociological factors that are going to influence how Jewish life in Latin America is constructed and what that means when they come here, when Jews from Latin America come here and find a different organized Jewish life. So this is a picture of, it's a picture of the anniversary of Moisesville, which Moises Vita, which is a colony of a Baron Hirsch colony, which was a project that started in the 1880s to populate parts of Argentina with Jews from Eastern Europe. They didn't stay, for the most part, in this area, but it's part of the Argentine Jewish folklore that Jews are real gauchos, they're real members of the Argentine tradition. Nonetheless, I love the picture, which is why I put it up. But Jews came to Argentina, Mexico, Brazil, Uruguay, Chile, for the same reasons Jews came to the United States. They were leaving places. They were leaving the Ottoman Empire. They were leaving Europe. They were leaving places partly because of political persecution in general. We know now that most people tend to leave for economic reasons, more so than political persecution. At least that's what newer studies have shown. But and yes, most people would have liked to go to the United States in general, though Argentina was doing pretty well at the time too. But they sort of went where they could go. And if it was Mexico, it was Mexico. It wasn't Mexico till a little bit later than in the United States for political reasons. In the United States, in 1924, issued something called the Hart-Celler Act, within a political climate that's not so different from the one we're living in today. And essentially, Jews from Eastern Europe were no longer welcome. Those weren't the kind of immigrants they wanted. I think rhetoric that we hear often now too. These are not the kinds of immigrants that the United States wants. So Jews from Eastern Europe could no longer go, or Jews from the Ottoman Empire, Jews could no longer come to the United States. So they ended up in Argentina. But what they found in Argentina, sorry, I'm looking at this picture, but let me find another picture. This is a Mexico picture, so so we can talk a little bit about Mexico, a little bit about Venezuela, the different countries that Jews went to. What they found in these countries were countries with deep ties to Catholicism. I don't have time today to talk about the different experiences in each Latin American country, but they're very different given the political and economic structure of each country, but there are some similarities. One of them is the deep ties to Catholicism. Another is the inability of the state to provide the kinds of services that the United States is able to provide its citizens for various political and economic crises, which results in communities that are more close-knit. That's number one. It also results in communities that tend to be more urban and stay urban. So the suburbanization of the United States dramatically changed ethnic communities. In Latin America, communities tend to stay urban for the most part. So when you have ethnic communities that live in close geographic proximities, you have ethnic communities, ethno-religious communities that stay more close-knit, tend to be more likely to do business with one another, and also attend ethno-religious institutions in a way that the United States Jews no longer do. Why does that happen? Well, it happens in large part, we have all over Latin America, the Jewish communities are run by a Kugel, so a sort of central governing body, which is quite different than what happens in the United States, where Jewish communities are more likely to be decentralized. That's number one. Number two, what we have in the United States is that in Latin America is that as Jews were able to climb the socioeconomic ladder, they maybe no longer wanted to send their kids to the public schools because they weren't that great. There was also high anti-Semitism. So as they wanted to go to country clubs, they weren't allowed to go into country clubs. So they created their own. So they went to Jewish day schools. They still go to Jewish day schools. In fact, Latin America has the highest attendance of children at Jewish day schools. I think Mexico is the leader among them. They created what they called sociodeportivos, which are these large social sports clubs that compete nationally, compete one another, have big cultural events, and are really the hotbed of Jewish communal life in Latin America. Here we have the JCC, which, as some of my respondents say, well, I mean, it's a place to go play basketball, you know, but it's not really what it was like for us in Latin America. Our life was going there. We had the swimming pool and friends were there and business was done. This is where Jews became not just Syrian Jews, Aleppo Jews, or Turkish Jews, or Polish Jews. They sort of became Venezuelan Jews or Argentine Jews. This is where pan-ethnicity begins to happen among the Jews in Latin America. So there are many ways to be Jewish without being religious. So that's an important point that plays into what they find here in the United States. And I put up these pictures because I wanted to show that culture also influences how people construct identity. Let me just go back. So this is a picture of Hebraica, is one of these socio-deportivos that I was talking about in Argentina. And this is the women's soccer team, I apologize. The women's soccer team in front of the Western Wall in Jerusalem. In Argentina, there's been books written about this and about how oftentimes Jewish ethnicity can be displayed through affiliation with certain soccer teams, with certain sports. I think Bob can probably tell you more about this, but and also, so there's sports, there's music, there's literature, there's food. There's Jewish Mexican cookbooks. And we tend to think of, we don't give food the value oftentimes that it kind of deserves in these studies of ethnic identity construction. But people say to you, well, how are we Jewish? Well, we both grew up eating matzo ball soup, and we both grew up eating Kugel, right? These sorts of things. So in Mexico, people say, well, I'm different because my food is Jewish Mexican food, right? And it's one of the building blocks of cultural and ethnic identity. So I wanted to know, okay, so I interviewed these people and I would sit down and I would ask them, so tell me a little bit about your background, tell me a little bit about, your Jewish identity. How do you identify now? And they would go, well, I don't know, it depends. It's often situational. And it depended on a lot of things, right? One of the things that it depended on was race. Okay. So there's race, there's socioeconomic status, there's education, there's their professional status, who their networks are. And there's also who is allowed in, who's allowed into certain groups, and what groups do they want to be a part of. So I really sought to understand, okay, well, at what points do these respondents feel that they can be Latino or Argentine or Mexican? At what points do they walk into a Jewish institution and they feel just as Jewish? And if they don't, do they become Latino Jewish? So Mary Waters and David Middleberg are two sociologists that talk about something called ethnogenesis. And they say, well, if an immigrant comes and they're not accepted by one group and they're not fully accepted by another group, then what happens is that they create a new group. There's a change in ethnicity. And I thought, when I set out to do this research, I said, oh, that's what's going to happen, right? I'm going to find ethnogenesis. And I sort of found that it's not that simple. People don't just say, well, I'm not this or I'm not that, so I'm going to become something else. There's a lot of other factors that come into play. So I'm being Jewish in the US. When do people feel Jewish and when don't they? So as I mentioned, Jewish identity and Jewish communities in Latin America are very different. So unlike Latin America, synagogues are at the center of Jewish life here. Of course, in many ways, we try to have other sorts of organizations that often are not as successful in attracting the kinds of or community building that non-religious institutions have in Latin America. And what happens, particularly with Jews that have come here move to the suburbs, for example, where they don't send their kids to day school, and they don't send their kids to Jewish day school because they might be too religious, they're too expensive. They might want some sort of avenue into Jewish life, and they find it at the synagogue, but that's not really where they feel like that's their Jewish experience. So this isn't to say that Latin American Jews don't attend synagogues or don't become members. Most don't become members, but that's another story. But they do, they do participate. They just feel like, well, it's not exactly how my Jewish life was lived. So one thing that does happen, though, which I thought came out as a very interesting finding, was this idea of ethnic capital. So ethnic capital, we talk a lot about social capital, we talk about cultural capital, even human capital, sort of all of these things that we can access to gain a foothold in another country, to gain access to people, to jobs, to knowledge, to whatever it may be. And I found that one of the things that happened with Latin American Jews is that they relied heavily on something that I call ethnic capital. So ethnic capital is this idea that there are bonds and trusts between people that people have on this, on a feeling of mutual connection. And that often happens with immigrants, where people will say, "Oh, what's our connection? You're from Mexico. I'm from Argentina, and we're both Jewish. We have a connection." They might not, but we imagine these connections, and that also happens with Jews. This first quote is from a woman. I'm sorry, from a man who said, I don't want to take advantage of things, but I let people know I'm Jewish if it's the kind of situation that is going to help me. And another thing that people did was they said, well, I also want to let people know that I'm Jewish because then they know that I'm different from a racialized Latino in the United States. So here's where race is important too, right? It's a signal to others that say, well, sure, I'm Mexican, but I'm different. Because people are very quick to, not only are they quick to pick up on the racial dynamics and the racial hierarchy here in the United States, they bring over some embedded class hierarchy and discrimination that they already have in place from their home countries. So whereas people felt that in many ways they were absolutely Jewish, that Jews, for the most part, accepted them, even though they felt a little bit on the outskirts. They said, well, nonetheless, I have a real Latino. They wouldn't, all of my interviews were in Spanish except one. And these were people that have been here for 50 years. So these people are still speaking Spanish. They, and this is one of my favorite quotes. She said, well, it creates a special, distinct connection. It establishes a pleasant, quick moment of intimacy. And it's so easy to disregard these small moments, but this is actually what connects us to the larger social world. And this happened over and over. So in many ways, people would say, there is a power hierarchy with people that are serving me, whether it be in a restaurant, whether it be someone that cleans the house, the ways that these people encountered non-Jewish Latinos or Latinos of different socioeconomic classes. But at the same time, they felt that they could make connections with them. So there was that aspect. And then there was another aspect. This woman said to me, I have a Latina identity. And then she goes on to say how I see the mystery of life, everything, even how I laugh. And then she goes, even how we die is different. So she's saying, we're different. Latinos are different. There is a warmth. There's a calidez. There's a vibrancy. We love life. Family is more important. All these cultural values that we used to hear, perhaps, about second-generation Jewish immigrants in the United States. Now the Latinos are saying, we're not like los Americanos. Right? There's something about us that's different, and that's what makes it so hard to fit in. So this is how race, class, and privilege fit in to the scheme here, and how people really differentiate themselves from their either non-white or non-Jewish or folks not of their social class. And this is absolutely something that they bring over from their home countries to some extent. But at the same time, people don't really have any qualms about being Latino when it comes to affirmative action for the most part. And interestingly, it works for some people and not for others. Everybody that I spoke to for the most part said, well, you know, I am, but I'm not. But if I have to check something off for school or even preschool, then I definitely am Latino. And this is not the only group that does this. We know that oftentimes the beneficiaries of affirmative action are not the folks for whom affirmative action was set out to help. So you know, there's absolutely instances where not only is ethnicity and situational, but you know, it's also strategic. So in all of this, we have a lot of people that say, well, I am, but I'm not. So how does a Latino Jewish ethnicity and community emerge? Well, it really has to do with who's coming, at what time, at what point in their life are they coming, the historical timeline of when they're coming to this place. What's going on in the place that they're coming to? And location and geography. Where are they coming to? What does the place look like? So this is where the different locations of where I did my research becomes really interesting as an idea of how institutions and how location play into community building. So this is our lovely New York City subway. It's vast. Don't be jealous. I know we were saying, but it smells and the trains are still the same, but yes, it allows you to get everywhere, but it takes a really long time to get everywhere. So on the one hand, we love it, yet we also hate it. I put this up because I want to talk a little bit about what happens when you come to New York. So you come to New York City, and New York City is an expensive place to live. Most people that come don't come with their families to settle in New York City unless you're a very high socioeconomic status. And even then, the people that I met were saying, oh, my life with my family was much better in Mexico or Venezuela or wherever they might be. So people that come to New York tend to come on their own. They tend to come, this is the who, right? Who's coming, the demographics. They tend to come, usually it's young professionals, or they come for school. And so we know in the literature of the life course that that's when people are not necessarily going to turn to any organized religious institution. They're in New York, it's hard to get around, it's expensive, they sort of live where they can live. They don't necessarily live amongst, their friends if they can. If they can't, they can't, because you get an apartment where you get an apartment, you're busy, because New York is a place where you work. There's an expectation that you spend a lot of time working, a lot of time studying, and most people don't have a family. In fact, most of the people that I interviewed people over time, and some of them that eventually had families moved out of the city. They moved to New Jersey, they moved to Long Island, Westchester, and they didn't stay in New York. So what happens in New York is that it's hard to create community. it's hard to create particularly a new ethno-religious community. And the only time it happens is if there's a larger institution that steps in. So this is a Purim party at the Jewish Latin Center, which is a Chabad center. And the Jewish Latin Center, the rabbi is Brazilian, and it attracts young Latin American Jews from who live in New York City, and this is where pan-ethnicity, so this idea of ethnogenesis, of building a new group identity, happens. And it happens, sociologists say, well, we know that new assimilation happens when people start to marry across group lines, and this is what happens here. So in the first few years that I was going, you had the tables. You had the Argentine table and the Venezuelan table and the Uruguayan table and the Colombian table. Over the years, these tables would start to mix. And now you have larger networks of people from all over Latin America. And they start to marry one another. So you have a Venezuelan who's marrying a Mexican. And they're forming a real pan-ethnic, right? But their connection is their Jewish connection. And they're no longer just a Mexican Jew or a Venezuelan Jew, they're a Latino Jew or a Jew of Latin American descent. But this is really the only time that I, for the most part, saw this in New York. And in New York, as one of my respondents said, it's easy to be a Jew. Just by being here, I'm a Jew, And it's true, there's Jewish vernacular in everything. The street vendors sell knishes. People use Yiddish all the time. You see the big moving companies called schleppers. These are the sorts of things that in New York, you don't really have to try too hard. And so they don't, oftentimes. And it's not until they leave New York or when people form families, they start to look for community. This is a map of Aventura, which is in Florida. It's South Florida, right next to North Miami Beach. It has the largest Latino Jewish population in the United States. And the Cubans don't live here, by the way. It has the largest Jewish immigrant population. It has Russians, it has Israelis, it has Latinos, and it has Latin American Jews from really all over. And they've been coming to this part of Miami, North Miami, since about the 1980s. It started with the Peruvians, and they've come after the Colombians, Argentines have come in two waves, Venezuelans and Mexicans, and now it's been a huge influx of Venezuelans. But what's different? And why it matters, why geography matters, is a number of reasons. Aventura is relatively small. There is no subway, though there are some free buses, which is nice. But the geography of the place and the architecture of the place is very conducive for community building. So for example, you have buildings that are around communal areas. So people will meet at the communal pool or at the communal playground. And as they meet and they hear Spanish, they start to form networks and bonds, friendships. So that's one thing that happens. Another thing that happens is that when folks arrived here, the schools were not so great. And people didn't necessarily want to send their kids to the local public school if they could help it. Now there's a charter school and things have changed a little bit. So they started to send their kids to Jewish day schools. Now the Jewish day schools there, many of them were attached to synagogues. And the synagogues, so when we think about the historical timeline piece of this, these synagogues were mainly comprised of an aging population. So this was really, the area was really ripe for renewal. Folks were either passing or moving up north. A lot of retirees bypassed Miami altogether and moved further north now. And people in the area were also moving further north. So you have all of these institutions that existed and no people. And here come the Latin Jews and they say, all right, we'll go to synagogue if it's free. And they went, and it was free. And then after a time, some of them paid, not all. And they got scholarships at the school. And over time, some of them paid. And so you have these schools, and you have these synagogues that serve predominantly a Latino Jewish population. And in this way, the institutions work to build a Latino Jewish community. You also have a JCC there that has something called Hebraica. So Hebraica was the Socio Deportivo, the social sports club that we have in Argentina. There's one in Venezuela. There's one in Brazil. This is the name that and so they have transferred some of these, they've created or recreated some of the same sense of institutionally supported communities in Miami that they had in Latin America. And again, because it was ripe for it. There weren't that many people there. You weren't competing against other people. You want to come to New York and do something like that at the JCC on the Upper West Side, it's not going to happen. But in Miami, they were like, all right, we don't have that many people. We could use more members. You want to build a new program? Sounds great. So they participate in the Maccabea Games. They do something called a Madrichim program, which is a program where young Jewish youth are trained to be counselors. This is a very big part of this adolescent stage in Latin America. So this they do in Hebraica in Miami. They go to Israel together. These are sort of and they're all Latin American Jews. They keep on speaking Spanish because, as I mentioned before, the community gets replenished, right? So more Latin American Jews come in and they speak Spanish. So they continue to speak Spanish. Also, I don't know how many of you have been to Miami lately. It's kind of hard to get around without speaking Spanish in Miami. So it's easy. They have a lot of events in Spanish. They have a lot of both cultural events that are Jewish and Latino in nature, and they have religious events. Many of the synagogues will hold services in Spanish. They try to do services in the manner that is more like people knew the services in their home countries. But what happens, again, like I mentioned at the Jewish Latin Center, is that people are enlarging their networks, making networks, and marrying outside of their national country of origin. So this is when you really begin to see these groups, these networks, that form new Latino Jewish communities and identities. I know, isn't this cute? So this leaves us with a number of questions and a number of quick conclusions. And the one is that ethnicity is salient and important. And so is race, and so is a class. So it can be used, ethnicity can be used and accessed differently for members of different racial groups and socioeconomic groups. And I think that this was particularly eye-opening with this group of people that I interviewed. Number two, which we always want to know, is what's going to happen to their children. I don't know, but I can make some guesses, but we really don't know. In large part, what we do know is that ethnicity is maintained when you have a replenishment of new immigrants. I don't know how many Jews are left in Venezuela now, so I don't know how many will keep on coming over. But what happens in Miami and what doesn't happen in other places is that Latin American Jewish life is maintained because there's constantly new immigrants that come, and they bring some of their country from their culture from their country, their Spanish, their cultural modalities, their food, their way of practicing Judaism to Miami, and they find a place where that can be easily incorporated. So if people stay in Miami or in the area, it's likely that they will continue to have some sort of Latino Jewish identity. And what's for sure is that the institutions have changed. in a way, the institutions are different. In the same way that the American Jewish heritage in many ways is we can look back to the Ashkenazi tradition and think about how it influenced what the American Jewish tradition is. We can think about how particularly in Miami, the Latin American Jewish tradition influences the Jewish community today. And the other thing that I do want to say is that the majority of my research, or rather all of my research, was done pre-Trump. So I didn't talk about anti-Semitism at all, but anti-Semitism has been has spiked a lot in Latin America in the past 20 years. It's always there. Sometimes it's more overt. Sometimes it's not. And I've asked people recently, well, do you still feel like it's safer here? One of the things that people said about one of the comments, or some of the comments people said about being Jewish here, is that it's so easy to be Jewish. I can wear a Star of David and nobody cares. They celebrate Hanukkah. Some of this in New York, for example, we have holidays off for public schools. The high holidays are off. They say, I don't feel like I don't need to hide my Jewishness in the same way. And that's still true. And it's primarily still true because in general, Latino Jews tend to migrate to areas to the coastal areas where there are large Jewish populations, and anti-Semitism is not a daily thing. Nonetheless, I do think it's important to point out that it's not the same as it was 5 years ago in the United States, and we are facing a different political reality. And that is all.
All right.
Many thanks, Laura.
Thank you.
Very nice. And I assume you're willing to field questions
Yes,
now?
I always like to keep it shorter than longer so that you can ask me questions and also your eyes don't start to glaze over and, Excuse me.
So, Laura, thank you very much for this really interesting presentation. I have to apologize after running in a few minutes, so I'm going to ask a quick question. You talked initially about how people are respond to this idea of Latino Jews, like this kind of surprise that there are Jews in South America, in Central America in the first place. But like part of what you're describing here also is the shrinking of those communities.
Absolutely.
And that they're moving to the U.S. So what is the future of those communities, and what's the relationship between the migration of those Jews and the growing centralization of Jewish communities in the U.S. in general? So that's one question. And the second thing I just want to ask very briefly is, you're talking about Miami. That sounds a lot like Los Angeles with urban Jews, and so I'm kind of curious if there are any sort of comparable aspects between the Latino Jewish immigration and migration of other non-Ashkenazi. So, Laura, thank you very much for this really interesting presentation. I have to apologize after
Okay. So in terms of shrinking Jewish communities, and what does that mean? I don't know. I think they're shrinking, particularly in some countries more so than others, and this has been happening for years. I do think that what we are seeing in the United States, and partly, oftentimes in academics, I would say we're a lagging indicator of what's really going on, rather than a leading indicator. So if we can think about our research as showing is a little bit behind the times. But what we are finding is that more and more academic scholarship in the United States is happening around new Jewish communities, right? And that gives us some insight as to how the American Jewish experience is changing as a result of having new immigrants, because it's not just happening in Latin America. Jews are leaving places where things aren't great, I always like to. I always tell my students to think about things in a historical timeline and think about, well, what's going on in the rest of the world, but also let's take a step back and think, well, at what Jewish life was like when the Germans were the Jewish German immigrants, and what it became when the Eastern European Jews were the largest immigrant group, changed the face of American Judaism. And I think that to some extent that's happening also. And also Chabad, but that's another project. And your second question was?
Oh, it was about sort of comparable aspects with other.
Oh, yes. So one of my ideas was to actually do some research on Persian Jews. There's a little bit, but not too much. What a big difference is that they all come from Iran, whereas Latin American Jews are coming from different countries. And I really wanted to see to what extent are new identities forged and created. So that's number one. And I work close to Great Neck in New York, where there's a large Persian Jewish population. But what we are seeing, interestingly enough, is that yes, they're very tight-knit communities. They've become more religious over time, particularly in Great Neck. And that's one way that the second and third generation stay in the community. But if they're not religious, they also oftentimes assimilate much more so into the larger Jewish American mainstream.
Susie.
Thank you again for your talk. I really appreciated it. So as a third generation Texas Jew, I would say that the kinds of ethnic pockets of Judaism, or maybe not even ethnic, apply much more widely than just Latino versus American Jews, in the sense that I think Jews from the South and Jews from Texas have a very different identity than New York Jews, almost like they're a completely different group altogether, versus Jews from the Midwest or from the far West. So I think that those kinds of cultural distinctions are much more nuanced than just, Latino Jews versus American.
I think that's true.
But in very much the same ways of influence. So I guess my question to you is, as you look at pockets of Latino Jews throughout the United States, are you finding strong regional developing variations, so that Miami Latino Jews have a whole different identity than New York Latino Jews? Don't feel like they're related to them at all, and that their food and their word choices and their Spanish even becomes different.
It's interesting. I hadn't actually thought too much about. I really hadn't thought too much about New York Latino Jews versus Miami Latino Jews, and I think that that's an interesting point. And I think oftentimes, as a New Yorker, it's myopic of me to really think of Jews as New Yorkers. However, or New Yorkers as Jews, I guess it could go either way. However, what happens is that not so much of if we can talk about this, if we can think about this as sort of like American Jewish folklore, it is the New York Jew, and that's what people see, and that's also what immigrants see, right? So they come here, and this is their idea of what it means to be Jewish. So I think you're absolutely right, and I don't think I don't think we, myself included, do enough work on thinking about these sort of different localities and what that means. So I absolutely, yes, think it's myopic. Yet, who's a Jew? I mean, we still think of, Philip Roth as the sort of the I mean, there's others that are no longer part of for other reasons. But the New York Jew and everything that surrounds it, the Jewish story and the immigrant story, and as being a New York story in many ways.
Yes.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on that in a way because I grew up in San Antonio, Texas, and the Jewish community in San Antonio, like for instance the Bexler family, he had a junk business in San Antonio, but the grandfather came from Romania to Montreal. I think he either had family in Montreal or they spoke better Yiddish there. I don't know that. And then he ended up in San Antonio and opened up a business called Monterey Junk Business. And they sold in Mexico. So, you know, a Jutino, that was the Vexlers for me. I mean, when they had a birthday party, they broke piñatas. So you have, there is probably even more so in Los Angeles and Southern California. They had a series of exhibits last year or the year before called Pacific Standard. And it was focused on the relationship of Latin American art to the Southern California area. You have true transnational identities that the borders are really porous. You know, they don't really matter. People do business across. They do now under Trump. I mean, but there is a cultural identity that I wonder if that what impact that has on your kind of analysis.
Sure. So this is not my expert. In fact, I'm learning, more and more, particularly what happens at the borders in the border states. And it wasn't the focus of my research. I think it's absolutely fascinating, and I think that there's so much more to learn about it, and so much more when we think about how identity is constructed, particularly at the border. There's which is a little bit different than the research that I'm doing in terms of that I've done in terms of forming new communities and forming new identities. But I think it's absolutely interesting and valid, and can relate, though I'd have to think more, sort of in what ways. And I think the nice thing is that there's always more to learn and more to think about. Absolutely. Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's more like a comment on an extension of what somebody has mentioned before. From my own experience as a Jew coming from Latin America, coming to the US, one of the things that kind of shocked me was finding the diversity in denominations in the US.
Mm-hmm.
Because in Latin America, being Jewish, there's only one way to be Jew.
Right.
There's not the amount of options that you have here in the US. You could be a reformist or you could be a conservative.
Yes.
That was a new reality to me. I wasn't
Yes.
exposed to
Absolutely.
that before. And I guess, I don't know what your experience in the interviews is with people about finding
Oh,
that
sure, yeah.
Jewishness is not the unique thing.
Well, that was, I think, I asked people, there was a question that I asked, do you identify as, Reform, Unity, all of these, and they would say, I don't know. All of them would say, I don't know.
It's strange. Yeah.
And I'd say, well, this is more like, like this, and what do you think? Well, I don't know. I guess conservative because, but I'm not really sure. So I think that really speaks to your point that, yes, absolutely. It's that, it's another way that things are different.
And not only that, there's also, at least again from my experience, growing up a Jew in Latin America, in my generation, my experience was that the older generation of Jews, they were already associated with the power structure in the Latin American countries. They were in business and they were connected to some politicians, but the younger generation of Jews, which were my folks, the people that I went to school, at least in my generation in the 60s and 70s, they were more social conscious, and they were embracing leftist ideas and all that stuff, and there was a generational gap among the Jews.
Which is not unlike,
But what I see, I'm from Colombia originally, and what I see from the Jews from Colombia that came to the U.S. recently because of the political upheaval and all that, and they had to migrate to Miami, and when they come to the U.S., they become totally capitalist, and they forget about all these things.
right, but I don't know if that's just
The social consciousness.
I don't know if it's just the Colombian Jews that forget about that, though. You know? I don't know.
Elaine. Yeah.
I think my question might be personal to me, but I'm interested in how the new different people came to America with different Spanish varieties when
Okay.
they got here and how that happened. When, you know, even Colombia and Peru have somewhat
Sure,
different
sure.
Spanish. Yeah.
I think you mean what ends up happening, sort of.
Yeah, or how difficult it is, and whether there comes to be a Spanish that comes together. Or,
Sure. I think people pick up other colloquialisms from other countries, so you would end up having this. I wouldn't say it's a new Spanish. You know, you will always tell an Argentine accent, but there might be some Mexican slang thrown in. And you see this a lot in these. There, you know, my research really focused on Jews, but you also have a lot of sort of upper socioeconomic class of Latinos that tend to have big, important networks. And then there's a lot of trading of language, where you almost say, I can't really place where you're from.
did anybody can't understand for other groups?
No, particularly amongst this sort of socioeconomic group, yeah. And they tend to be well traveled, and the thing that we tend to forget about Latin America, I think, is that the culture, in many ways, is transnational, right? So I grew up watching Mexican soap operas and Argentine films and movies and Colombian and all of those things. So in many ways, yes, they're all very different countries, but in some ways they all share an important piece of culture.
And Mike, you have something.
Building on what Susie and Bob were saying, when you do your historical bit, you might want to add that when the idea was to settle people in Argentina at the same time, a group was settled in Palestine and another group was settled through Galveston. And that builds on what Susie was indicating, because with the Galveston movement, you didn't have a clump of people, a large clump being put in one place. It was done, two people will go to this Dallas, 2 people will go to Fort Worth, and 2 will go to San Antonio, and arrangements were made in advance with the then existing Jewish communities in the small towns, and said, could you take this person and get the person a job and so forth. So it was a different approach.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, and we had a question over here.
Yeah, very interesting. Lovely to hear you. Thank you. I'm a New York Jew who now lives in Texas. And the one thing that I would love to know more about is the similarities. I'd like to know something that's in the DNA that makes me feel what I see in the Texas Jew is very much like what's in the New York Jew. Certain values, certain attitudes are very much the same.
I don't think it's in the DNA.
You know, I'm sorry. I don't think you don't?
No, I mean, I'm a sociologist, so they would kick me out of the academy, But there was a number of things that I think play into that. On the one hand, if we talk about at one point we spoke about how Jews were distinctive, their values were different. Today, they're much more likely to be middle-class values than they are to be just Jewish values, but oftentimes we hold them as part of our identity. I think that's number one. I think another thing, too, that we can think about is that we often perform ethnicity. we highlight certain aspects of our ethnicity to show a common bond in many ways. And the third thing is that I think about this as the sort of the least common denominator. We absolutely focus on the things that we tend to focus on the things that we have in common. And form connections. And then I think that there's a fourth, and it's an idea of what we create and imagine, right? And we imagine, communities. We imagine that in some ways, and it's just because we imagine it doesn't mean that it's not salient, but we imagine a shared culture.
But we do.
Absolutely, and then there are things that are the same. You celebrate similar holidays. You might have a similar accent because your mother spoke that way. You might. It's possible that your parents and somebody else's parents are from similar areas, and they're, wherever they're from. I think all of those things play a part. But today I would argue that Jewish values are not so different than what we think of as traditional middle class values, is what I would argue today.
Alexander, are you exercising your hand or do you have a question? Okay.
So I kind of was wondering when we were talking, two questions. One is what kind of, when we talk about the cultures coming in, I guess the gentleman over here, we're talking about a more Orthodox community coming in as far as like practices, or what is it? I guess what is that? And like, are they bringing their practices? Because you talked about them coming to these institutions and going to those institutions. So are those institutions changing for them, or are they changing to the institutions? Yes. And with that, I'm wondering, what are the numbers we're talking about?
Sure. So I'll start with back. There's about 180,000, not very many. So that's number one. But there just aren't that many Jews. I mean, there's a lot of, that's a tiny percentage of the Jews in the United States. There's not that many. But they tend to be active, particularly in certain areas. They're not Orthodox for the most part. Though I did interview some Orthodox. I really tried to get people sort of I did the sort of classic, do you know anybody else I could interview that's not like you? So I did a lot of that. And they were absolutely Orthodox. And there were absolutely some Orthodox, but not a lot. In large part because two things happen. If folks have a strong religious commitment, or if that's a big part of their identity, they're going to seamlessly fit into an Orthodox community, much more so, right? They're not going to. Jewish identity is a big part of who they are, so they are going to be much less likely to have those. Well, I am, but I'm not, because that's really there's one of their, bless you, their primary identities. Are they remaking institutions, or are the institutions remaking them? So I studied under Richard Alba, who famously said, immigrants have remade America, right? They've remade what it means to be an American, right? At the same time, this happened because America has also sort of acted on the immigrants, right? So they both. The institutions are absolutely not like they are in Latin America, because people go to public schools, and in Aventura, as I was saying, people would go to day schools, but over time there's a charter school, and if they get into the charter school, which is free, they're going to the charter school. They're not going to the Jewish day school. So already you start to have more of an assimilation into what is a sort of traditional Jewish American life. Yet they go to a synagogue on a Shabbat Friday night service, and they all hang out afterwards, and there's kissing, and there's Spanish, and there's different kinds of meetings and networking and those sorts of things. And they've remade, in some extent, what it means to go to a Shabbat service. It's maybe livelier, or there are more families, or they speak more Spanish. The songs are different. What the rabbi says in his sermon might be different.
So let's have just one last question.
Can I just make a comment?
Okay.
I grew up in Colombia, and I have to know who you are. And I think that one of the aspects of being a Latin Jew is that we are closer to the shtetls of Europe than a lot of Jews in this country, because for the most part, our parents came from Europe.
Sure.
So our institutions what they did is they replicated the institutions that they knew in Europe. So when they came here, for example, the communities in Miami, I think what they have done is that they have replicated the life that they had there in Miami.
Sure, absolutely.
And
To
I
the
think
extent.
the whole idea of being whether conservative, orthodox, we didn't have that because we all were brought up by immigrants. So we were brought up conservadox, which is what they knew in Europe.
Sure, sure.
Okay, well, many thanks for a wonderful lecture, and thank you for your questions.
Thank you. Thank you.